Yo, what's up guys, it's Nick2, and today I'm going to be showing you guys a Devastator build that is super good for leveling and is also pretty solid once you get into the end game. I'm going to be 100% transparent with you guys though. This build is pretty great for the earlier tiers up until around CT 10 or 11, but it's going to start to fall off a ton once you get around those higher challenge tiers, specifically in a solo context. If you're playing with other people, it's okay. Your damage is going to be a bit lower than theirs typically, but it should be fine with other people. But solo, I was able to get to CT 10 in roughly like 4 hours of playtime, which is pretty decent, and that was with a relatively suboptimal build. Fairly certain you could get at least like 12 with the right setup, but honestly, the truth is just that Devastator is underpowered. While every other class is able to do damage that ignores armor, Devastator just can't do that, and the higher the difficulty you're playing on, the more armor the enemies have. So once they start to get a ton of armor, you just get really ineffective. However, I do have a solution for you guys. The only problem is that it's just very gear dependent. So what we're actually going to do in this video is we're going to first take a look at the build that you want to start out with, since it doesn't really take a lot of gear to get set up, and it's actually pretty solid while leveling, and even during the earlier tiers it actually is pretty decent. And then what we're going to do is just take a look at a second build that is specifically meant for once you're around CT 10 or so to make that final push to CT 15. The reason that we aren't taking a look at the second build first is because it's incredibly gear reliant. I know a lot of you are going to be typing, you should be using an anomaly power build, blah blah blah. The reason we're not starting out with that is because it's really gear reliant, and when you're trying to gear up, level up, etc., you don't want to have to rely on absolutely perfect gear, and you don't want to have to be sitting there farming forever just to be able to do the next expedition tier, which is why we're starting out with the first build first. And honestly, the main purpose of these videos is to help you guys get your feet off the ground so you can start slamming through the end game with your friends. I would highly recommend taking a look at the second build even if you're just starting out, just so that you have an idea of what type of gear you should be saving and what you're going to end up playing. But until then, you'll be perfectly fine running the first build, and of course you could just come back on the video and check again later. If you're only interested in the second build, I'll have everything timestamped, so make sure to hop towards the end of the video if you're interested in that. Big thanks to my friend Dadrage for helping me contact this Devastator player Grykks and helping me get this gameplay, and obviously big shout out to Grykks himself. Anyways, sorry for the long intro. I just felt it necessary because I don't want this video to be misleading, and I just want you guys to know what you need to be able to do to hit CT 15, and that's what we're going to do. So since we're going to be covering two builds, I'm going to try to make this brief. I'll do my best while covering all of the pertinent information, but let's just get into it. Also, make sure to check out my Twitch if you haven't already. Thank you. So the main goal of this build is to get as much weapon damage as we possibly can. The thing about Devastator, which I see a lot of people doing incorrectly, or at least in my opinion is incorrect, is that you have a bunch of built-in survivability, and then people try to spec for even more survivability because it seems really helpful. But the fact is that you just need to take advantage of what you already have built in, and you need to go full weapon damage, especially because you're at a disadvantage damage-wise. So with this build, we pretty much went full damage, and that's what our skills are for. We are using Gravity Leap, which is a kinetic. We're mainly using it for kinetic to proc our extra weapon damage node, which I'll talk about when we get into the class tree. And we're using Endless Mass as well. Endless Mass we're using because it has some mod to make you do some extra damage when using it, but also it is also a kinetic. And then we're using Golem in the form of our protection skill, as that is going to also buff our damage, but at the same time this is going to give us pretty much all the survivability that we need. We're not going to really need anything extra on top of this, so this is going to allow us to kind of spec more into damage while still maintaining that survivability. The only skill I would recommend ever swapping out would be Gravity Leap. You could very easily swap it to Boulder Dash, or hell, even Earthquake if you really wanted to, but I play with Gravity Leap just because I like the mobility and because it is a kinetic. Boulder Dash is also kinetic, but I think it's a little bit clunky and it's not, it's too synergistic with this build. You could even swap Gravity Leap for Reflect Bullets for more uptime on the protection if you really wanted to, but this is currently what I recommend, and that's what I used all the way up to CT 10 after doing a lot of testing. So hopping into the class tree, we're pretty much only going to focus on the top tree. That's because that's what's going to get us the most weapon damage. Bottom tree is for anomaly power, and that's what we're using for the second build, so we'll talk about that. Middle tree just gives you a lot of survivability that I don't think is worth it, and you'd rather just get the flat extra damage from going top tree. So if you didn't already know, by the way, every close range kill is also going to heal you for 24% max health, and by default you have a bit more armor and health than the other classes. That's your main healing mechanic. We're also going to talk about some more survivability stuff later on, but let's just get into the tree. So first off, you just want to increase your weapon damage, and then we're going to increase our shotgun weapon damage. I think you kind of have to use a shotgun when it comes to Devastator. I tried using some other weapons and the damage really just wasn't there. If there's something else that you would really prefer, you could probably go for that, but honestly I think shotguns are the way to play, at least with this first build. We'll get the shotgun weapon damage, and we're just going to increase our close range damage again. and then we're going to get Shotgun Master. Here we're going to pick the Armor Piercing, as Armor Piercing is pretty important, but also we don't care about the assault weapon damage, and then we're going to get Havoc to increase our damage even more. And then this is where a lot of our survivability comes from in tandem with Golem. Whenever an enemy dies in close range, 20% of their armor is transferred to you, and they have a lot of armor, so you just get a lot of armor as a result of that, so that's pretty good. And then we're also going to use Champion, where we get extra weapon damage for 10 seconds every time we use a protection skill. This isn't going to be up super often when we end up having our Golem set up with some mods. However, it's still pretty much free extra damage, and if you're using Reflect Bullets as well as Golem, you can have this up a lot of the time. And then for the next tree, when you're using a shotgun, it probably doesn't really matter that much. You don't really have much recoil, and you're not going to crit too often, so I just go for the crit because I guess it ends up resulting in more damage. Then we're going to go for Havoc again. If you're using an AR or something, you can go Assault Master. And then for the next part of the tree, we're going to go Brawler to increase our close range weapon damage. Then we're going to go Havoc to increase our weapon damage even more. Then we're going to get some reload speed, increase our magazine size. And then enemies who damage you will have their physical damage reduced. This effect is doubled if you damage an enemy as well. We get a lot of survivability here. So as you probably know, we're just getting a lot of survivability built in. So stacking even more on top of that is just going to result in less damage. And that's not what we want since our damage is already not great. So we're going to pick up Confrontation. Definitely go for the Armor Piercing here because enemies have a lot of armor and you need to be able to pierce through that. And then we're going to get Altered Charge. When a kinetic skill ends, increase your weapon damage by 70% for 10 seconds. So anytime we use Endless Mass pretty much or Gravity Leap, we're getting this extra 70% damage. And this is the main source of our damage, so this is very good. Now we have 3 points left over. Typically, I would either go into Dry Them Out to get our weapon leech up, but mainly Bounty Hunter to increase our damage against elites, and it also reduces their damage. But for the other point, I want to go into Perpetual Motion. I think it might even be better to go double Perpetual Motion and then Armor Breaker than it would be to go up here. That's honestly up to you. The reason that I like Perpetual Motion is to just get the cooldown on our Endless Mass really low so that we have really high uptime on Altered Charge, and also just so we can use it a lot because we have some mods that make our Endless Mass make us do more damage. But also just being able to use the skills more often is really good, and Flat Armor Piercing is really good because the enemies end up getting just a ton of armor. However, if you really want extra damage against elites, you could totally go Armor Breaker, or sorry, Bounty Hunter. However, I just like the extra damage or cooldown reduction here. So pretty much the main way that we are getting extra damage with our mods, since barely any of these increase our weapon damage, and that's what we really care about. Early on, increasing your skill damage is going to seem pretty good, but once you get more and more firepower on your gear and the enemy's health starts to scale up, you're going to notice that that number isn't going to be nearly as impactful. So we want to be prioritizing our weapon damage. There's very little skills to do that, or mods rather, and that's one of the reasons why this class is a little bit weaker. But also, since there's very few of them, we definitely need to get those. So the first one that we're going to pick up is Shattered Armor. Whenever you use Endless Mass, it increases your weapon damage against affected enemies by 20% for 10 seconds. It's only 20%. This used to be like 50% in data mine stuff. I think they should buff this to that number and that would be fine. But regardless, Endless Mass to increase our weapon damage is really good. And then we're also going to use Endless Mass Inflict Vulnerable on all the enemies applied by the skill, which is going to apply Vuln, which is going to make them take 25% extra damage. So pretty much anytime you use Endless Mass, you're getting 25% extra from Vulnerability, 20% from Shattered Armor, and then another 70% from your kinetic skill. So that's over 100% extra weapon damage whenever you're using this, which is really going to help you out a ton. There's not really any other skill mods that are going to increase your weapon damage by a ton, so the rest of the stuff we're going to go for is either general mods or some survivability stuff. So one survivability thing that I picked up that I think is necessary is Perseverance, which is going to increase Golem's duration by 100%. If you pair this with Golem of Death, where whenever the skill is active, you extend it by 2 seconds for each enemy killed, this is going to make it to where you can have Golem up very reliably and almost all the time if you're making sure to kill enemies a lot. And this alone is going to give you enough survivability to where you never really have to worry about survivability again. Another way to get some survivability would be to get Weapon Leech on your weapon, or maybe some Leech in the skill tree. Any little bit of healing could help you out since your only way of healing is going to be once you kill stuff. But this is going to give you just a ton of Golem uptime, which is going to give you a lot of damage reduction. In terms of a lot of the other mods, like I was saying, pretty much none of them increase your weapon damage and stuff, so we don't really care about them all that much. If you plan to use Reflect Bullets, you would probably want to use the mod where it applies Vulnerable to all the enemies that get hit by it, and then you also want to use the one where you can fight while you use it. but honestly, I would recommend just using Gravity Leap, but that's entirely up to you. And then another mod that's pretty good while at least leveling, and you could probably use it at endgame if you don't have many other options currently, is Resistance. Whenever Golem is active, you're going to increase your resistance by 33%. This is pretty good just for additional survivability, especially because our Golem is going to be up all the time. In terms of the rest of your mods, general mods like tier 2 mods are going to be your best friend. My build is pretty scuffed. I have like this Boulder Dash mod that isn't helping me, this Power from the Ashes mod that isn't helping me, Life Absorption I don't think is all that good, etc. I have multiple things that aren't helping me and I'm still able to do okay. If you get your gear decked out in a lot of tier 2 mods that are going to increase your damage, since that's kind of the only way you have to get damage, you're going to do a lot of extra damage. So one way to get some extra damage is with Bloodlust. Every killing shot increases your firepower. This is really good. Another one is buckshot shells, just to increase your shotgun weapon damage. Alternatively, you could get dum-dum bullets to increase your assault damage. If you're applying bleed frequently, if you use like the Golem mod that applies bleed, you could use Vampiric Mag to get some of your ammo back. That's pretty good. Pair that with Bloody Boost, you get 15% extra damage to enemies afflicted with bleed. Pretty solid there. And then another one that's good is Personal Space, giving you 15% bonus to close range weapon damage, which is also pretty good. A lot of the tier 2 mods are pretty much your only way of getting damage, so I'd highly recommend trying to get those. In terms of what you want on your gear rolls, you just want firepower absolutely everywhere. Anomaly power and max health is just not going to help us out at the moment, and we want to try to get either cooldown reduction or close range damage, preferably close range damage because our damage is pretty low. You pretty much just want your piece to look like these pants here, however, without that mod that isn't helping us, because you want cooldown reduction to make your Endless Mass a shorter cooldown and your Gravity Leap a shorter cooldown. And also you just want that close range damage for extra damage. Just make sure you get firepower and everything, otherwise you're going to have a bad time. In terms of getting ammo back, this is one of the really big things. I guess we'll talk about weapons. I'm using a narrow variant shotgun. I think this is one of the best weapons that you can use for Devastator because it just does a lot of damage and it's pretty consistent. The only way I found to get ammo back consistently on this character, at least when using a shotgun, so that you don't have to like use a restock and stuff, is using Perpetual Mobile. You're going to instantly replenish your magazine if you kill an enemy at 35% or less. Unfortunately, because I had to use Perpetual Mobile, my second weapon mod is completely useless at this point. If you got a different weapon mod like Death Chain, Storm Whip, Bone Shrapnel, Killing Spree would be really good. Anything else, that's going to improve your damage a ton with this build, and that's going to make a really big difference. So if you find a shotgun with Perpetual Mobile already on it, so you can swap out the second mod, that's really good. Or if you have a way of applying bleed and then using Vampiric Mag, that's also a pretty good way to get ammo back. I wouldn't recommend using Clip Roller because that's going to take ammo from your reserves and then you're going to end up having to reload, and that really just sucks. So this is pretty much what I recommend for Devastator while getting from 1 to CT10. For the weapon, probably just go for shotguns. Almost any shotgun variant is good. Pump action is pretty good too, but I would recommend pump action or a narrow variant of a pump, or a narrow variant of a, what is it called, automatic shotgun, and try to go for weapon leech and close range damage on it. So that's going to do it for the first build. Now let's talk about the second build. So as you can tell from the gameplay, this build is more going to revolve around using your skills to inflict bleed, and then you have a legendary set where you increase your damage against enemies with bleed, and then you're going to be using some weapon mods that are going to just do flat damage because your weapon damage is going to be pretty low, and then you're just trying to have your skills do some damage as well. As you can see from the damage breakdown from this tier 15 chem plant that Grykks ran, the top damage that he did was with Earthquake, and then his second damage was actually his weapon mod, and then his fourth damage was another weapon mod, and then his fifth damage was a weapon mod, his sixth damage was a weapon mod, and his seventh damage was a weapon mod. So getting weapon mods is incredibly impactful with this, but he was able to do pretty good damage with Earthquake and Impale. Prior to doing a 15, you could probably be okay with this without the legendary set, but like I said, this build is incredibly gear reliant. So let's take a look at what build he's running so that you guys can try to emulate the same thing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because this video is already long as it is, and you guys probably can get the picture. So with the skill tree, you're pretty much just focusing on your seismic abilities, getting some anomaly power and then some seismic cooldown reduction. Both of these are survivability options, and then we just get a lot of extra seismic damage from these bottom nodes here. And then we pretty much just fill out the tree by increasing our seismic damage by 50%. I'll show you in game since he doesn't actually hover over them. So we just want to get like anomaly power, seismic cooldown reduction, anomaly power, and then using a certain skill increases our anomaly power, get more firepower from our anomaly power, and then we just get some more armor here and some increase on seismic damage. In my opinion, I think it would be a little bit more optimal to go up here rather than spending the 2 points here. I think it would be a little bit better to go up here to get heirloom armor, because this is just going to give you a ton of extra armor when you're using this. You could also even go paladin, and then you can use a protection skill instead of gravity leap, so that you have extra anomaly power for your earthquake and your impale. But I don't have the gear, Grykks does, and he's using the build, so feel free to just completely emulate what he's doing if you're interested in making this, if you don't trust me. But that's just my own personal judgment, and that's what I think that I would do. But a lot of these builds have a lot of room to be changed. Now let's take a look at what gear he's running. So mainly a lot of his damage is coming from his weapon mods, right? So for his first weapon, he's using the Daima, which is going to do ultimate storm whip, but also shadow comets. This just does a lot of damage. So pretty much in the gameplay, he's just swapping from weapons, do some damage with this weapon because the mods are going to do base damage. It's pretty decent. And then he swaps to the other weapon because his second shotgun, the Anemoy, has Moaning Winds, where when he uses it, it does almost 400k damage AoE, and it's also on an 8-second internal cooldown, but also Kinetic Stomp is a cooldown. So pretty much every 4 seconds he's swapping back and forth weapons. There's a few other weapons like the Juggler, when you shoot and then you reload, it like does an explosion. There's a lot of stuff like that. Pretty much any weapon, specifically legendaries that give you flat extra damage, just stacking those on top of each other is really good, because your weapon damage is going to be bad, so you don't really care about weapon damage. You care about just getting flat damage from this, especially because that's going to scale when you get extra damage against bleed with the legendary gear set. So let's take a look at what mods he's using now for his legendary. So as you can see, he has the 3-piece Seismic Commander, which is going to increase your damage towards enemies with bleed. But also you can see he has Ultimate Impaler, which is insanely good for this build because it makes it to where you can use Impale 2 extra times, and this is one of the reasons why this ends up being pretty good. And then you also throw an extra Quake there, so you can use Earthquake more often. And of course, you want Anomaly Power on every piece of gear. And then for the second piece, we have another Seismic Commander piece to where Impale can hit extra targets, also very good. And then he's also using Untamed Power for whenever he uses skill, it deals some damage, so it does deal some flat damage. And also he's going to have a lot of Anomaly Power, so it's going to do a lot of damage overall. And then you probably want to get Anomaly Power cooldown reduction on probably almost every piece. Status Power is okay, I guess, because you don't really have anything else. But I guess just to keep the bleed up on enemies. And then for the next piece, Anomaly Power, Status Power, cooldown reduction. And Tainted Blood, this is very good. Increase the damage dealt to enemies afflicted with bleed. So you're going to be doing 75% extra damage to enemies with bleed with this set and that mod just by itself. And then he went for Perseverance Shield just to get some additional HP. I would probably go for something like Damage Absorber just for some flat armor. There's also something that doubles your armor when you get under 35%. I think that would be a little bit better. You could maybe even forego this if you play Golem instead, and then you got the additional damage on Golem. Or sorry, additional duration on Golem, and then you also get the 45% anomaly power when you use a protection skill. And then for the gloves, we just have Earthquake, increases damage, so that's pretty good. And then a mandatory one where Earthquake is going to inflict bleed. So you pretty much Earthquake, Impale, Earthquake, Earthquake, Impale, etc. Use your weapon mods in between to get that extra damage against enemies with bleed. This is mandatory because that's your main source of applying bleed. And then for the boots, we just have it to where you can activate Earthquake another time, which is another almost mandatory mod. Unfortunately, his boots are rolled with max health. He probably should deconstruct these boots to get the mod and then put that mod on another pair that has anomaly power. The build will probably do a good amount of additional damage. I imagine he just hasn't gotten other boots to be able to do that yet. But that's another mod that's really good. So as you can tell, this build is very gear reliant, but with the right gear, you can do pretty good, as you saw in his gameplay. So yeah, that's going to pretty much do it for the video. If you guys have any recommendations for your anomaly power builds, leave it down in the comments below. But as you can see, this build works. It's a little bit slower than the other classes in terms of clearing speed, but this build, his isn't hyper optimized. If you were to get it perfectly optimized, I actually think that you could do a ton of damage with this and clear things relatively quickly. So yeah, hopefully this video helped. If it did, please make sure to drop a like, subscribe for videos similar to this one, and I will see you guys later. Peace.